Captain Darnell had never been this scared in his life. His ship, the nebulous star, had been flying smoothly through the endless void of space just hours before now the starry sky had turned to nothing but a blur of fire and smoke. The ship was crashing fast. He had no control. Panic surged through him as alarm screamed in his ears, and the floor beneath him shook violently. He could see the ground coming closer, a large planet with deep forests, towering mountains, and a bright blue sky stretched out below him. Darnell gripped the controls, desperately trying to steer the ship away for what seemed like certain doom. But it was useless. The ship's engines were failing, and the last thing he could do was brace for impact. There was a loud crash as the ship's bottom hit the surface of the planet, sending shock waves through the craft. Darnell was thrown out of his seat and slammed against the control panel. The world spun around him, and everything went black. When Darnell opened his eyes, he found himself lying in a pile of broken metal and scattered equipment. His head throbbed, and his vision was blurry. Slowly, he pushed himself up, feeling the weight of the wreckage on his body. The ship was ruined. Parts of it were scattered everywhere, and smoke rose from the twisted metal. He couldn't see the rest of the ship from where he lay, but he knew there was no chance of fixing it. He groaned as he tried to move, forcing himself to his feet. The pain in his ribs was sharp, but he knew he couldn't stay there. He needed to find help, or at least get to a safe place before anything worse happened. Darnell stumbled through the wreckage looking for his emergency pack. His heart raced, hoping to find a signal, but there was nothing. No working comms, no beacon, no way to contact anyone. As he made his way through the wreck, the sound of distant footsteps suddenly reached his ears. It was strange. There was no wind, no animals, just a faint, heavy thud of something approaching. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Was it a wild animal, or worse, something more dangerous than the ground beneath him? Trembled. The footsteps were getting closer, growing louder. Darnell's instincts told him to run, but he was too weak to move faster. Instead, he crouched low behind the wreckage, trying to stay hidden, trying to remain as quiet as possible. The noise grew louder still, and then out of the trees, two massive figures appeared. Darnell's breath caught in his throat. The figures were towering over him, easily over 30 foot tall. They were humanoid in shape, but terrifyingly large and imposing. Their skin was a pale, almost silver color, and their long hair flowed like dark streams down their backs. They had sharp, angular features, eyes that gleamed like sharp stones, and large, powerful limbs. But it was their teeth that made Darnell's heart race even faster. They were long, pointed, and looked like they could rip through metal with ease. He had no idea what these creatures were, but his mind raced with terrifying thoughts. Were they predators? Were they going to eat him, the giantess? He thought they must be females because of their appearance. Stopped in front of him. They didn't seem to notice him right away. They were staring at the wreckage of the ship with a kind of curiosity, but there was no sign of any aggression. Darnell stayed as still as possible, holding his breath. His mind was spinning. Should he try to run? Should he fight back? He had no weapons. He had no chance against them. One of the giantesses suddenly turned her head and looked straight at him, her eyes locked onto his. And for a moment, time seemed to stop. He felt his stomach drop. The giantess tilted her head slightly, her sharp gaze studying him. Then, to surprise, she stepped forward, her massive foot landing only a few feet away from him. The ground shook with the force of her step. Darnell flinched, his body tensing, but instead of grabbing him, instead of attacking, the giant knelt down, bringing her face close to his. Her huge, sharp teeth gleamed, but she didn't open her mouth to bite. She merely stared at him with those intense eyes. The second Gianni joined her, crouching beside the first. Darnell could feel his heart thumping in his chest, and he forced himself to keep calm. He wasn't sure what was happening, but he didn't dare make a move. His mind was racing with questions. Were they friendly? Was he about to be eaten? What did they want with him? For a long, uncomfortable moment, neither of the giantesses did anything but watch him. They didn't speak. They didn't growl or show any sign of aggression. Instead, they seemed curious, almost puzzled by him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the first giantess made a sound, a deep, throaty hum. She reached out with one of her enormous hands, her fingers almost as large as Darnell's entire body. She gently touched his shoulder, her hand as warm as a heated stone. Darnell flinched, but he didn't move away. The Gianni didn't hurt him. She wasn't trying to crush him or eat him. She was simply touching him. The Second Giante leaned closer, making a soft humming noise of her own Darnell. Felt the air shift around him. He had no idea what to make of the situation, but one thing was certain: he had no idea what these creatures were, and he had no idea what they wanted. Darnell's heart raced in his chest as the Giantesses' hand remained on his shoulder. He could feel the warmth of her skin, and yet there was no pressure or pain. Her enormous fingers didn't squeeze or crush him, just rested there as though she was testing his presence. The second Giantess, standing beside her, tilted her head, watching him with the same intense gaze. Darnell's mind was spinning. What did they want with him? Were they going to kill him, or were they somehow trying to understand him? He tried not to panic, reminding himself that so far they hadn't attacked. After a long pause, the Giantess, with her hand on his shoulder, withdrew it slowly, as though she had realized her touch might have frightened him. Her movements were gentle, but everything about her was massive. Her arm was as thick as a tree trunk, and her fingers were like the branches of an ancient oak. She seemed to study him carefully, her deep, intelligent eyes watching every small movement he made. The second Giante stepped forward, her massive feet landing with soft thuds on the ground. She lowered her face to his level, her enormous blue eyes narrowing slightly as she examined him. Darnell found himself frozen, unsure whether to move or say something. The two giants, Tez, didn't speak, but they communicated in a way that was far more unsettling than any words. It was as if they were reading his every thought. Then, with a soft, almost musical sound, the first Giantess hummed again. This time it wasn't just a low hum. It was a sound that seemed to vibrate in the air around him. Darnell was surprised to feel the hum reaching through his chest, filling the air with a strange warmth. It wasn't the kind of noise that made him afraid. It felt strangely calming, like the sound of a lullaby or a distant song. Darnell had no idea what was happening. Could it be some form of communication? Were they trying to talk to him? He swallowed his dry throat, making it hard to breathe slowly. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words felt small in comparison to the enormity of the situation. "I don't understand you," he stammered, though he wasn't sure why. He said, "Was it even worth trying to talk to them?" The second Giante shifted her weight, her massive form moving gracefully despite her size. She seemed to gesture at him with a slow wave of her hand, as though trying to show that she wasn't a threat. Darnell took a step back, instinctively wanting to retreat, but the Giantess didn't seem to mind. She didn't move toward him aggressively. Instead, she seemed to just wait. The first Giantess, who had been quiet for a while, finally spoke. Her voice was deep, and it sounded like a mixture of growls and soft hums, unfamiliar and strange to Darnell's ears. It was as if she was trying to communicate with him in a language that wasn't entirely human. Her words were long and drawn out, like a song from a distant land. Even though he didn't understand the words, there was something gentle in the way she spoke. Darnell shook his head, still unable to make sense of what was happening. They weren't hostile, but that didn't mean they were friendly either. How could he be sure they weren't just playing with him before striking? He looked around, scanning his surroundings. The forest around him was vast, and the shipwreck was barely in the grand landscape. He had no idea how far he was from any other human settlement. He couldn't survive on his own for long without help. But could he trust these Giantesses? The second Giantess made another soft sound, almost like a question. She was staring at him intently, as though waiting for him to answer her. Darnell felt the weight of her gaze on him, and it made him feel smaller than ever. But instead of fear, he felt curiosity. These creatures weren't like anything he'd encountered in his life. They weren't behaving like typical predators. They didn't seem to want to harm him, and yet they didn't seem to understand him either. Darnell took a deep breath, and with cautious steps moved closer to the Giantesses. They didn't move to stop him. The first Giantess watched him closely, her large, intelligent eyes flickering with interest. As he approached, he wasn't sure why, but he felt a strange bond with them. They weren't like the creatures he feared in the wild. They weren't hungry beasts, but something different. "I don't know if I can trust you," Darnell whispered, almost himself, but the Giante seemed to hear him. She leaned in closer, her breath warm against his skin. She made the same soft humming sound again, the vibrations filling the air. It was as if she was trying to reassure him, but Darnell wasn't sure how to respond. "Please," he said, speaking slowly, unsure if they would understand his words. "I need help." The second Giantess looked at him thoughtfully, her expression softening. Then, without warning, she slowly reached out her enormous hand, hovering near him. Darnell didn't flinch this time. He waited, watching her carefully instead of. Grabbing him, the giantess made a delicate gesture. With her fingers, it wasn't threatening, but almost inviting, like she was offering him a chance to come closer, to be part of something. Slowly, Darnell nodded, his pulse quickening with both fear and hope. Maybe, just maybe, these creatures weren't his enemies. After all, for the first time, he dared to take another step forward. The giantess's hand moved closer, and Darnell knew this was a decision. He wouldn't take back this strange, unexpected encounter might just change everything. Darnell took a deep breath, steadying himself. The giantess's hand was now hovering just a few inches away from him. He could see every detail of her fingers, how they looked like smooth, pale tree trunks, strong and firm, yet delicate in their movements. He hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to trust her. He could still feel the weight of the situation pressing on him, but something inside told him that running away wouldn't help. The second Giante, who had been silently observing, made a soft noise, a low, gentle hum. Darnell looked up at her. Her gaze was calm and curious, not aggressive in the least. He could see the kindness in her eyes, and the sense of danger he had felt earlier seemed to fade away, replaced by a strange, unfamiliar feeling of safety. Slowly, Darnell stepped forward and placed his hand in the giantess's. The warmth of her skin surrounded his hand, and he felt something shift inside him. The fear he had been carrying with him seemed to lessen, replaced by a deep sense of awe and wonder. The size difference was still overwhelming, but it no longer felt threatening. The giantess gently lifted him, her fingers as soft as they were strong. She didn't seem to be in any hurry, taking great care not to hurt him. Darnell found himself rising off the ground, the forest floor shrinking beneath him. He was in the air, now cradled in her hand like a fragile object. He looked up at her, and for the first time, he didn't feel like prey. He felt protected. The first Giantess Atha looked down at him with what seemed to be approval in her eyes. She made another deep pee, and then, without a word, she began walking. The second Giantess Via followed close behind her, stepped soft but powerful. The ground shook with each footstep, but Darnell didn't feel afraid. It was as if the very presence of these giant beings made the world seem smaller, less dangerous. As they walked, Darnell noticed how different everything seemed from what he had expected. The trees here were unlike any he had ever seen. They were taller, their trunks twisted in intricate patterns, and their leaves shimmered in shades of blue and green, glowing faintly under the sunlight. The air was fresh and cool, and the smell of flowers and earth filled his senses. It was a strange, beautiful place, a world that felt ancient and alive. Darnell couldn't help but ask himself what kind of creatures were with these giantesses. How had they come to live on this planet? He had no answers, but for now he was more focused on staying alive. And Via didn't seem to be in any rush. They moved with slow, careful steps, ensuring that Darnell was comfortable in their hands. They seemed to communicate in their own way, without words, but through movements and sounds that Darnell had yet to fully understand. As they walked deeper into the forest, Darnell began to notice something else, a strange, low rumble in the distance. The ground seemed to tremble slightly, and the sky above darkened. It was hard to tell what it was, but something was coming. The giantesses tensed for a moment, and Darnell could see their eyes narrowing. AA's protective stance became even more evident. As if she were preparing for something, the rumbling grew louder, and Darnell could feel his heart rate quicken, his mind race with questions. What could it be? Was another threat? AA stopped walking and looked up, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon, for Atu seemed to be on high alert, her head turning as she listened to sounds of the approaching disturbance. The air around them seemed to grow heavier, charged with strange energy. Darnell couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he knew one thing: something dangerous was coming. Suddenly, a massive shape appeared through the trees, a huge creature, its body covered in dark, tough scales. Its eyes glowed red like embers, and its teeth were like sharp, jagged rocks. It was a predator, a creature built for hunting. Darnell's stomach twisted with fear as he realized what was happening. This was no accident. The giantesses hadn't been just walking. They had been on a mission to protect something or someone. The beast snarled, showing its sharp fang, and charged toward them. It was fast, surprisingly fast for something so large. Darnell's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the creature approach. Was this the end? Was he going to be caught in the middle of a battle between these Two giant creatures, but before he could react, Atha sprang into action within. Incredible speed that Darnell didn't expect, she swung her massive arm in front of the beast, blocking its path. Her strength was immense. She didn't just stop the creature. She sent it skidding back into the trees with a powerful swipe. The beast growled in anger, but it didn't come back immediately. Via stepped forward, her hand raised. She made a deep, almost musical growl that echoed through the forest. Darnell could feel the vibrations of the sound in his chest. It was a warning. The beast hesitated, its eyes flicking from the two giantesses to Darnell as if considering its next move. Ayla moved again, this time closing in on the creature. She didn't rush, but her movements were decisive. With one swift motion, she grabbed the creature by its throat, lifting it off the ground. Effortlessly, the beast struggled, but it was no match for AA's strength. She held it there, her expression fierce, but controlled. Stay back, AA's deep voice rumbled, though it was more of a growl than words. Arel didn't need to understand her language to know she was warning the creature. The message was clear. The beast finally stopped struggling, realizing it was no match for the Giantesses. With a final frustrated growl, it turned and retreated into the forest, disappearing as quickly as it had arrived. Darnell couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. The two giantesses had protected him without a second thought. They had fought off a terrifying creature as if it was as nothing more than an annoyance. A and Via returned to Darnell, their expression softening. The danger had passed. They were calm again, and Darnell realized something important. These giantesses weren't just protectors of the forest. They were protectors of him too. Darnell was still trying to process everything that had just happened. The giantesses, Aa and Fra, had just fought off a massive, terrifying creature with ease. He couldn't believe it. He had barely had time to react, and yet they had handled the situation as if it was no big deal. As the last echoes of the creature's growls faded into the distance, the forest around them seemed to settle into an eerie calm. The air was still, and the only sound left was a soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. Darnell exhaled deeply, realizing that he hadn't taken a full breath since the beast had appeared. He looked up at AA, who was still holding the creature in the air with a strength that seemed almost unnatural. Her expression was calm, but there was an edge of determination in her gaze. Via, too, looked unaffected by the fight. Her body was poised, ready for anything else that might come their way. Darnell felt a strange sense of safety around them. Despite their size and strength, they didn't seem like the kind of creatures that wanted to harm him. They had acted to protect him without hesitation, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. He hadn't even needed to ask for help. They had simply known what to do. For a moment, Darnell stood there unsure what to say or do next. He had never been in a situation like this before, where he was so completely out of his element. The planet was strange. The creatures were far beyond anything he had ever imagined, and here he was stuck between them with no idea how he had ended up in the middle of it all. AA slowly lowered the creature, releasing it back onto the ground. She didn't make any sudden movements, but the beast seemed to understand that it had lost the fight. It let out one final growl before it turned and disappeared into the trees, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. Vika turned her attention to Darnell, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. She was still quiet, but there was a sense of understanding in her gaze. It was almost as if she was waiting for him to say something, but Darnell wasn't sure what to say. After a few moments of silence, Atha finally spoke. Her voice was deep and resonant, almost melodic, though the words were still foreign to him. Darnell tried to make sense of her tone, but he couldn't understand the language, even though she hadn't spoken to him directly before. He could tell that she was trying to communicate something important. I don't understand what you're saying," Darnell muttered, glancing between AA and for he knew they couldn't understand him. But he hoped his words would somehow reach them. "But thank you for helping me." It tilted her head slightly. Studying him, she hummed again, the low vibration filling the air. It was soft, almost like a question, and Darnell wondered if she was trying to understand him in return. He looked down at the ground, feeling a little foolish. What was he supposed to do now? Was he supposed to leave? Was there some kind of agreement he needed to make? To his surprise, Vera stepped forward and made a soft, low noise. It wasn't like the growls or hisses that Darnell had heard earlier. It was gentler, almost like a hum similar to The sound Atha had made Ka extended her hand toward him, not in a threatening manner, but in a gesture that seemed to invite him to come closer. Darnell hesitated for a moment. He had no idea what was going on, but he could sense that they were trying to communicate in their own way. He stepped forward slowly. Cautiously, he wasn't sure if it was safe, but it seemed like the right thing to do. As he moved closer, Via lowered her hand, allowing him to stand beside her without. Feeling threatened, Ayla turned her head and looked at Via, her sharp gaze. Narrowing slightly, the two giants exchanged a few sounds between them, soft hums and low growls, but Darnell couldn't make sense of it, whatever they were. Discussing it was clear that they were working together. There was an unspoken bond between them, something that went beyond words. Finally, after a few moments of quiet discussion, Atha turned her attention back to Darnell. She bent down slightly, bringing her face closer to his. Her eyes were filled with an unreadable expression, but there was something warm and reassuring in her gaze. Darnell stood, still waiting for her to make the next move. Without warning, Atha extended her hand toward him, her long fingers gently brushing the shoulder. It was a gesture that felt oddly familiar, like a touch of comfort from protector. Darnell's heart skipped a beat despite everything that had happened, despite the fear he had felt earlier. He felt a sense of peace wash over him. It was as if it was no longer alone in this strange world. Via too stepped closer, her massive form towering above him, but she didn't make any threatening moves. Instead, she offered him a warm, knowing smile. It was the first time he had seen such an expression from them, and it made him feel less like an outsider. He wasn't just a stranger to them anymore. He was something more. Ayla straightened up and gave a low, rumbling hum. She turned her head toward the forest, and Darnell followed her gaze. The trees stretched endlessly into the distance, and the sky above them was a deep, serene blue. The planet was wild, untamed, and beautiful. But it was also dangerous. Darnell knew that he still had no idea what had brought him here, but one thing was clear. He wasn't alone. These giantesses, as strange as they were, had shown him a kindness he hadn't expected. They had protected him without hesitation, and in return, maybe he could do something for them. Maybe this was the beginning of an unexpected alliance. The forest around Darnell seemed to stretch endlessly as the giantesses Aa and Frost stood silently beside him. He couldn't help but feel both awe and wonder. He had expected his time on this strange planet to be filled with fear and uncertainty, but instead he found himself surrounding Ed by beings that seemed to care for him, protect him. These creatures were unlike anything he had ever imagined, and yet they were offering him a kind of safety he hadn't known he needed. Aa was the first to move. She stood tall, her long legs carrying her with ease over the uneven ground. Her gaze never left Darnell as she took a few steps forward. Via followed her steps, almost silent despite her size. Darnell felt a strange pull to follow them, as if he was meant to go with them. He hesitated for a moment, still unsure of what to do. He had been lost on this planet for what felt like an eternity, and yet here he was with two giant beings that seemed to know more about this world than he ever could. Would they take him somewhere safe? Would they help him find a way back home? The questions raced through his mind, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't stay here alone. The dangers of this world were too great, and he had no idea how to survive. The giantesses, however, seemed to be part of this world in a way that he wasn't. They moved with purpose and confidence, their every action calculated and careful. Where are we going? Darnell asked aloud, his voice unsure. Aa didn't respond in words. Instead, she gave a low hum, the same hum he had heard earlier before the battle with the creature. It was calming, and Darnell could feel it vibrating in his chest. The sound seemed to soothe his nerves, reminding him that he wasn't alone in this strange world. Vika glanced at him, her eyes glowing softly in the dim light of the forest. She made a gesture, a sweeping motion with her hand, as if to show him the vast landscape that stretched out before them. Darnell followed her gaze, and he could see the endless trees and hills, the distant mountains rising high into the sky. Was this the path they were following? Darnell couldn't tell. He couldn't even be sure of the direction. It all felt so foreign to him, but what he did know was that he was no longer alone, and in this new world that meant something. The journey felt long as they traveled through the forest, the giantesses moving effortlessly through the dense underbrush. Their strides were long, but they didn't seem to hurry. Every now and then Aa would pause, looking around, as if sensing something in the air. Via would scan the surroundings her, sharp eyes catching every detail. They seemed to be on high alert always. Cautious as though they were preparing for another attack, Darnell wasn't sure how long they walked, but the sun began to dip low in the sky. The light turned golden, casting long shadows across the ground. The temperature dropped slightly, and a cool breeze rustled the leaves of the trees. The forest was peaceful now, the earlier tension gone, but Darnell knew that there could be dangers lurking just beyond the horizon. After a while, they reached a clearing. It was small, with soft grass covering the ground and large stones scattered here, and there a small stream trickled through the middle of the clearing, its water clear and shimmering in the fading sunlight. Alice stopped and knelt down, her massive form towering over the clearing. She looked down at Darnell, her eyes studying him. Carefully, Via stood beside her, her gaze focused on the stream. It seemed like they had reached some kind of resting place. Darnell looked around the clearing, feeling the strange sense of calm it was. A peaceful place far from the chaos of the forest. He didn't know why they had stopped here, but it felt safe. It felt like a place where they could pause, catch their breath, and plan their next move. AA made a soft humming sound again, this time lower and slower. It was like a signal, and Darnell realized that she was waiting for something. He wasn't sure what, but he didn't feel the need to ask. The Giantesses were communicating in their own way, and he was starting to understand their rhythms. Via moved toward the stream, crouching down to take a drink. Her movements were fluid and graceful despite her size. Darnell watched her, unsure what he should do next. He did want to intrude on their quiet moment, but at the same time he felt a deep curiosity about the world they lived in. Finally, Atha spoke. Her voice was low, almost like a rumble, but it was clear. She looked down at Darnell, her eyes softening as she spoke. Though he didn't understand the words, he could sense the meaning behind them. She was asking him something, or perhaps reassuring him. Her gaze was full of warmth, the fierce protector now showing the gentler side. Darnell took a step closer, feeling the tension leave his shoulders. It wasn't fear that filled him now, but a kind of trust. For first time since he had arrived on this planet, he wasn't afraid. The Giantesses had proven themselves to be powerful, but they had also shown that they weren't mindless killers. They were intelligent, thoughtful, and protective. The quiet peace of the clearing was interrupted by a rustle in the bushes nearby. Darnell stiffened, but before he could react, Via's eyes snapped to the movement. Her body tensed, and AA's posture shifted, as if ready for whatever was coming next. Darnell felt a rush of adrenaline, but the Giantesses didn't move in a panic. They were calm, ready for whatever danger lurked just beyond the trees, and for the first time since he had crash-landed on this strange planet, Darnell felt confident they would protect him. No matter what the rustling in the bushes grew louder. Darnell stood still, his heart racing. He didn't know what to expect, but whatever it was close. AA and Farah didn't seem afraid. Their posture was firm and calm, but Darnell could sense the change in the air. Something was coming, and the Giantesses were ready. AA took a step forward, her massive form moving with a grace that Darnell found almost unreal. She didn't rush, but her movements were precise, as if she had faced dangers like this many times before. Via mirrored her actions, her gaze sharp and focused. They were a team, and they worked seamlessly together. Darnell, on the other hand, fell out of place. He wasn't sure how to react or what to do. His first instinct was to hide, but he knew that wasn't an option. He had no weapon, no way to defend himself. All he had were the Giantesses, and from what he had seen, there was only hope. The rustling stopped suddenly, and for a moment, everything was quiet again. Darnell held his breath, waiting for something to happen. He glanced at Atha, whose eyes were narrowed as she scanned the bushes. Via was already moving to the side, her long limbs swift and fluid. They were preparing for whatever threat was lurking just out of sight. And then from the shadow, a figure emerged. It wasn't a creature like the one they had fought earlier. It wasn't as large or menacing. Instead, it was a small humanoid figure, barely taller than Darnell. It was covered in a patchwork of clothes made from leaves, animal pelts, and other strange materials. The figure's face was hidden by a hood, but its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light of the clearing. And Via froze for a moment there. Expressions unreadable. Darnell couldn't help but stare at the small figure. He had expected something much more dangerous, but this creature, whatever it was, didn't seem threatening. It stepped into the clearing slowly, almost cautiously, as if it was just as unsure about the situation as he was. The figure made no move to attack. Instead, it stood silently watching the giantesses. Darnell couldn't understand what was happening. Why had this small creature appeared? Was it an enemy, or was it something else altogether? A finally spoke, her voice low and rumbling. The words were strange, but there was a softness to them, as though she wasn't angry or threatened. She didn't seem to be warning the figure off. Instead, she seemed to be speaking to it. Via remained silent, her eyes never leaving the small creature. Darnell couldn't read her expression, but he could tell that she was waiting for something. She was ready, but not eager to strike the figure. Stepped closer, and Darnell instinctively took a small step back. His mind raced. What was going on? Was this creature dangerous? Could it be a friend, or had it come to cause trouble? But before he could think more about it, the small creature finally spoke. Its voice was high-pitched, soft, and vodic, almost like a song. Darnell didn't understand the words, but he could tell it wasn't hostile. The tone was calm, almost curious, like it was trying to communicate, not fight. AA made a low hum in response, and the small figure tilted its head slightly. The two seemed to exchange sounds, short, quick noises that Darnell couldn't comprehend. It was like a conversation, but one without words, just sounds and gestures. After a moment, the figure raised its hand, offering something to AA. The Giantesses looked down at the offering. It was a small bundle of plants and berries tied together with vines, a gift. Darnell blinked, trying to understand. The small creature wasn't attacking. It was giving something to AA. Was it offering peace? Vika stepped forward, cautiously, her massive form towering over the small figure, but there was no sign of aggression. She watched the exchange carefully, her expression still unreadable. She seemed to trust AA's judgment. So Darnell decided to do the same. AA bent down carefully, accepting the bundle. She sniffed it, inspecting the plants, and then gave a low approving H. Darnell watched in awe as the Giantess then straightened up and handed the bundle to Via. The second Giantess examined the offering, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. After a few moments of silence, Via made a low sound, something almost like a purring noise, and nodded. The tension in the air seemed to dissolve. The small creature smiled, its eyes bright with a strange kind of happiness. It seemed to be satisfied, as though the exchange had gone as it had hoped. Darnell couldn't believe what he was seeing. These two giantesses who had shown such strength and power in protecting him were now accepting gifts from a tiny creature. It was baffling. He had thought they were fierce and unapproachable, but now he saw another side to them, a side that wasn't just about brute force. The small creature turned to leave, its movements light and graceful before it disappeared into the forest. It looked back at the giantesses, offering one last smile. Then, without another word, it disappeared into the trees. For a moment, there was only silence. Darnell looked between AA and Frost, still trying to make sense of the situation. What was this world? What was the relationship between the giantesses and these smaller creatures? Were they allies, or was this some sort of unspoken agreement? AA and Via exchanged a few soft sounds, a kind of communication. Darnell had started to understand whatever had just happened. It seemed to be an important moment, a moment of peace, of understanding between two very different beings. As the night began to fall, the forest seemed to settle. The stars above twinkled there, light filling the sky with a soft glow. Darnell realized that despite the strange, dangerous world around him, he felt safer than he ever had before. Atha and Via were not just protectors, they were part of something much bigger, something that Darnell was only beginning to understand. And as long as they were with him, he knew he had a chance. The night settled in around them, cool and quiet. The stars shone brightly overhead, casting a soft glow over the forest. Darnell sat on a rock near the small clearing, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The encounter with the small creature still lingered in his mind, and he couldn't help but wonder about the world he had landed on. It wasn't like Earth. There were creatures of unimaginable size and beings like AA and Fra who seemed to exist on a level of strength and intelligence he couldn't even begin to understand. Atha and Via stood nearby, silently watching over him. Their quiet presence was oddly comforting, though he still didn't know what to make of them. They were so different from anything he had known, but there was no question in Darnell's mind now. He was not alone, they were protectors, and somehow he had become part of their world. He looked up at the sky again, feeling a deep sense of awe. It was strange to think that the universe was so vast, so full of unknowns. He had been an ordinary man living an ordinary life until that fateful day when he crash-landed on this strange planet. Now he was caught up in something far bigger than himself. AA stepped closer, her towering figure casting a long shadow over Darnell. She knelt down beside him, her eyes gently gentle and curious. Without a word, she extended a hand toward him, palm up. It was an invitation, a gesture that seemed to say, "Come with me." Darnell hesitated for only a moment. Something about the way she moved, the way she looked at him, made him feel safe. He took her hand, allowing her to help him to his feet. As he stood, he noticed that Vaya had moved to the edge of the clearing, watching the forest with sharp eyes. It was as if she was waiting for something. "Where are we going?" Darnell asked, his voice quiet but filled with curiosity. He still didn't understand much about this world, but he knew one thing: he couldn't stay in this clearing forever. The dangers of the forest were always lurking just beyond the trees. AA didn't answer with words, but her eyes seemed to speak volumes. She was leading him somewhere, and he had to trust that the journey ahead was unknown, but he couldn't stay where he was. He had to keep moving. Vaya turned and walked toward them, her long stride bringing her quickly to Darnell's side. She gave him a slight nod before turning her attention to the path ahead. It was clear that they had a destination in mind, and Darnell felt a spark of hope in his chest. For the first time since he had crashed on this planet, he didn't feel completely lost. Together, the three of them made their way through the forest, the light of the stars filtering through the thick trees. Above, the air was cool, and the sounds of nocturnal creatures echoed in the distance. Every step they took brought Darnell deeper into the unknown, but there was something about the presence of AA, and for that made him feel less afraid. As they walked, Darnell couldn't help but notice the beauty of the world around him. The plants were unlike anything he had seen before, glowing with strange bioluminescent colors. The trees were massive, their trunks twisted and gnarled, reaching toward the sky like ancient sentinels. The air smelled fresh, filled with the scent of moss and damp earth. After while they reached the cliff's edge, the ground beneath them sloped steeply, and Darnell looked out across the landscape. Below, the valley stretched out, with rivers winding like veins through the land. In the distance, he could see a towering mountain range, its peaks covered in snow. It was a breathtaking sight, and for a moment Darnell felt as if he was standing on the edge of something important, something grand. Atha and are stood at the cliff's edge, their eyes focused on the horizon. They seemed to be assessing the land, as if deciding where to go next. Darnell joined them, looking out over the vast expanse before them. "We need to keep moving." Atha finally spoke, her voice low and calm. Darnell could sense the weight of her words, the urgency behind them. Vaya nodded in agreement, her gaze still locked on the distance. There was no time to rest, no time to linger. Whatever their destination was, they had to reach it soon. Darnell felt a surge of determination within himself. He had no idea where this journey would take him, but he knew one thing: he couldn't do it alone. AA and Fred had already proven that they were capable of protecting him. He had to trust them, even if everything else felt uncertain. Together, the TRO began their descent down the cliff's side. The path was steep, but the Giantesses moved with ease, their shooted steps carrying them without hesitation. Darnell had to work harder to keep up, but he was determined to stay close. He couldn't afford to get separated from them, not in this strange and dangerous world. As they made their way down, the sounds of the forest grew louder. There were creatures calling in the distance, but they didn't seem to be near enough to pose a threat for now. The trio was safe by the time they reached the bottom of the cliff. The first light of dawn was beginning to break over the horizon. The sky was a deep purple, and the stars were slowly fading away. The forest ahead seemed different now, less menacing, more alive. The path forward was still unknown, but Darnell felt a sense of hope rising within him. They had survived this long with Atha and Fra by his side. Maybe, just maybe, they could make it through whatever the planet had in store for them. The journey was far from over, but Darnell had come to realize one important thing: he wasn't alone anymore, and with that thought he took his first steps into the new day, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead.